Hi everyone and welcome. I'm down here in my wormery and I've got some stuff set out here and it's pretty routine feeding. I've got a couple bins I want to get fed today. So I took some time to prep the things that I'll need. So I've got here a little tray full of what I'm going to be using as bedding, which is in this case an egg carton, a cardboard egg carton, shredded up into little tiny pieces. And I've got some grit here, and the grit that I'm using is pulverized eggshell. And the food items that you see in here are, one of my staple items is the coffee. These are just used coffee grounds. Don't know if I'm going to use quite everything that's in here, but quite possibly the better portion of it. And then down in here you just got a variety of different things that have been in the freezer now for a couple days. Just different bits of maybe the stem of a cauliflower collet or head. There's some old corn that had gone bad, and rather than throwing the entire corn cob in here, I just took off the kernels, and the corn cobs themselves, since they take so long, I've been tending to put them in my outdoor worm bin lately, or rather my outdoor compost bin. I do have an outdoor worm bin too, and I'll get around to feeding that later this week, but not today. And you can see other things here, a little bit more cauliflower, and you can see why this is in the worm bin. It's got some portions of it that have started to go bad. And I'm not even sure what the rest of this is. I guess cabbage and whatnot. So just a whole bunch of fragmented little bits of vegetable. And the bins that I've got in my sights today for getting them fed are, I've written them down right here. Let me just show you really quick what I had in mind. One of them is, there are actually two bins that are almost as far apart from each other in terms of being alike. They're about as different from each other as possible, with the exception of one thing, which is that it was 12 days ago that I fed the both of them. But other than that, one of them is nightcrawlers, and these are the European nightcrawlers that I keep in my VERMIBAG mini. And the other one is the plastic tub on the table next to me, which is red wigglers. And this is my newest red wiggler bin, which is now only 30 days old. And it's only had 3 feedings. Today will be its 4th. And in stark contrast to that, the European nightcrawlers have been working their way up to the VERMIBAG mini, beginning in smaller containers and eventually ending up in the largest of my containers. And they've now been going for 483 days, which is the equivalent of 69 weeks. And that's quite a while now, and, you know, as you can imagine, after that much time, that's 60 feedings that population has received over that time. So I just thought I'd really quickly go through what's on my game plan and show you what I'm using to get the job done. So why don't we head on over to, I guess we'll start with the red wiggler bin here, and we'll get these guys fed first, and we'll work our way over to the VERMIBAG mini. All right, let's get a little bit closer. Now this crazy contraption you see here is really just cardboard with a sheet of plastic covering it up. And the plastic is really there to try to keep the moisture within the bin rather than allowing it to evaporate out and be lost to the surrounding air. And then the other nice thing I like about having the plastic is that it always, you know, as a result of the moisture collecting on the plastic and then dropping right back down to the material beneath it, it always seems to create a nice cozy place that a lot of worms are drawn to. So it's always kind of cool to be able to open up your bin and find a whole bunch of worms hanging out there greeting you. Hey guys. Right away you can see that they're not too fond of the lights that I've got on overhead. So they're right away trying to retreat out of view. Unfortunately, this piece of paper right beneath them is preventing them from climbing straight down. I'm trying to remember now, it has been 12 days, and I've not peeked into here since then. But I believe 12 days ago when we placed this piece of paper here, I believe it was a perfectly rectangular piece of paper with no holes or anything missing. But the one thing that happens when there's an abundance of moisture on the paper, I guess the moisture itself probably has something to do with the paper becoming very soft and fragmented this way. But the fact that a large portion of it has actually vanished at this point can be contributed to the worms actually eating the paper. So I'm not sure if I really expected to see this much of it consumed, but then again, I usually check in on my worms a little bit more frequently than 12 days. Normally I'd be checking in on the bins, somewhere between 6 and 8 days, somewhere in the neighborhood of about a week's time, but on this go around I did feed very generously, so I did feel like I should probably give these bins a little bit more time before feeding them than usual. So the feeding that they received was administered in a way that's a little different from how I normally do it. Rather than just throwing the food in, I had used newspaper to bundle the food into these little, I don't know what to really call them, they're just little, bundles of newspaper with food inside of them. Treat it like a burrito or treat it like a wonton, whatever country you're in. But yeah, it was just a different way of applying the food so that not only is the food being added, but it's being added with kind of an abundant supply of bedding too, with that big piece of paper enclosing the food. So I believe the one that I'm seeing here closest to me is fairly intact, at least on the top of it, or at least it appears that way. And anytime you put paper in a place where it's going to pick up a lot of moisture from the thawed food melting and kicking off moisture, and then put it right in the line of fire of the worms trying to get at that food, chances are your sheet of newspaper that you use to wrap up the food is probably going to get gobbled up right along with the food. So I mean, we are seeing a little bit of the paper that was administered with this last feeding. I guess here on the very bottom we're seeing a larger piece of it, but it's not really a sheet anymore, it's just fragments full of holes. So I'm just going to put it over here. I think we'll just use all of this paper, the stuff that was covering the top, as well as the paper that was being used to wrap the food. We'll just use all that as bedding in the end. But look at all those castings, and look at all those worms. Wow. Looks like we've interrupted a big party going on here. Oh, that's all right. They're going to be pleased with what they're getting here, because they're going to be getting more food so the party can continue. So let's see how number 2 of these 3 little food bundles, wow, did. This one, I don't even see any of the paper that was beneath it. This looks like a little fragment or two of what was on top of it, but no signs of any of the food. Just a whole bunch of well-fed worms hanging out right there on the top. Look at all those castings. Kind of nice when you have a bin that's only about a month old and you can just really reach in and already get a handful of what appears to be castings only. So there was a third little food bundle placed in here. In here too we can see bits and pieces of it, but certainly not much. We'll set that aside to reuse it as bedding at the end as well. So I definitely like what I'm seeing here. This worked out quite nicely. It seems that the food was just about enough to get them through till now. I think, there's this looks like the shell of an avocado. I thought I noticed another little fragment of food right when I had first checked into that first bundle that we were examining. This looks like it might be the peel of an apple. This as well. So they did away with the majority of the food, but there are still tiny fragments of it remaining, as well as the paper itself, which also counts as food for the worms, especially when it's drenched in, the juices of all the food that they were consuming all along. So this bin is really looking nice. I like the moisture level. Here's the stem of a banana. This is probably the largest food fragment we found out of everything, but it's certainly not much. I'm trying to remember how many worms this bin had been launched with. I think it might be somewhere in the range of about 2,000 worms. That's a really nice size population for a bin this size. It seems like they're doing a great job. And I do have the intention of giving them a pretty plentiful feeding once again this time. And I don't know if I'm going to wait so long again as I did this time to feed them. But I was just kind of curious because most often I do come into my bins after only, 6 or 8 days, and I do find a lot of leftovers. So I really wanted this time to allow for a little bit extra to let them keep working it through so that I would see as little as possible of the previous feeding in here. So that's pretty much what I got. I can't complain. I think things turned out really nice in here. I mean, with the exception of that banana peel, a couple avocado shells, a little bit of apple peel, there's virtually no food left in here from the previous feeding. So the timing worked out just right too. All right, let's make sure we're not taking any hitchhikers along for the ride. It always seems like the little tiny baby worms are the ones that somehow end up adhering to my my glove. I always worry that I'm going to miss one and I'm going to end up dropping them out on the table where they're just going to end up drying and dying, which I don't want to have happen. So I think that's maybe about half, right? Save the remaining bits for the other system we're going to be feeding momentarily. This appears to be a pretty good amount of bedding material. I guess if I had to compare it to the 3 sheets of newspaper that I had crumbled up last time to include with their feeding, it's probably about the same. It's just a slightly different type of material, a little bit more thick, a little bit more rigid. But hopefully, once it starts to soften up and get drenched with the thawing food, hopefully the worms will start to break that down as well. So this has got some good weight to it. So now I was going to give them about half of what's in here and we'll save the rest for the other container. So let's just grab a few handfuls and see what we end up with. That's one really big, generous handful. And that's a second pretty big, generous handful. And I think that pretty much takes about half of what I had bought down here for them. I'm going to put a couple pieces back because it does seem like these little guys might have gotten a little bit more than what the next bin is going to be fed. And the next bin, I believe, probably has a slightly larger population in it. So I want to make sure we leave an ample supply of food to give them too. A lot of people have been asking about the application of grit and what to use and whatnot. So in my case, I'm using pulverized eggshell. You could be using pulverized oyster shells, you could be using rock dust, you could be using sand, you could be using any one of a number of different types of coarse, tiny materials that the worms can use in their gizzards to digest the food they're eating. And in the beginning, I always like to be pretty generous with the application of grit. And then eventually I start to see that the grit that I've been feeding them over time does start to show up as speckles within the finished castings, making me feel that there's probably plenty for them if they need it. But in the beginning, it seems to me like it's a good idea to keep adding it on a pretty regular basis, just to make sure they don't run, low on it. Now, I've got some more bedding material here that we can reuse, but let me also throw in some coffee. It's another pretty generous quantity of food, which is pretty cool. So I'll be curious to see how they do with this. I don't know how much time I should allow for this. So maybe 10 days. Who knows? Maybe I'll be back down here in a week. You never know. A lot of times it's not just looking at the elapsed time since their last feeding. A lot of times it's also a matter of, just food scraps piling up and needing to be somehow dealt with. So there's always different things that lead me to coming down here to feed these little guys. But in this time it was just the number of elapsed days that had passed. After 12 days it did seem like a realistic time frame to come down and give them some more food. And 12 days ago I did feed not only these 2 containers that we're feeding today, but there's also 2 other containers that I fed on that same day in a very similar fashion, using these little pieces of newspaper to wrap up the food they were getting. But those bins, I'm going to let them ride a little bit longer. You know why? Because even though those 2 bins that I'm referring to that are not being fed today do have huge worm populations, and they probably done away with the majority of what they were given, I did notice in those bins that there was a fair bit of leftover food from their previous feeding. So I felt like giving those bins a little bit more time just to make sure they do away with not only the food they had just received, but also the food that was still in there as leftovers would also be consumed. So I'm going to check in on those in a couple days. But that's it for this bin here. This is feeding number 4 for this 30-day-old red wiggler bin. And for now, I'm just going to keep sticking with the plastic covering. And at times, you know, sometimes I start to feel like the moisture level in the bin does start to exceed what I consider to be the right amount, and then the plastic goes away. But now in the beginning, I always like keeping the plastic on, at least until such a time that I feel like the castings have accumulated to the point where the bin can hold its own moisture without the help of plastic. Alright, so it's over into the VermiBag. Let's move the camera over there. Now here in the VermiBag Mini, I've had some sort of gnats or fruit flies have been trying to keep my worms company, and that's the reason I've got this piece of cardboard here covered in what's known as diatomaceous earth. And right away I could see a gnat or whatever that is flying right in front of my face. It's not bad considering what I've been observing in here previously in the past. I think I just saw 2 or 3 more. One crawling around, 2 more flying. There's another one. But you know, all in all, at this rate, if they keep dropping in their numbers, then hopefully I'll be through with them in a very short period of time. Then maybe I can do away with the diatomaceous earth and forget about the flying insects being pests in my worm bin here, my worm bag. Here too I had created a nice big hole so that I can place 3 of those big fat food bundles in here. Same way, newspaper wrapping up the food. So I guess we'll do a quick inspection to see how those bundles are progressing. I'm hoping we can simply move stuff aside and see how things are progressing. Drop in the new food and let this system get back to work. The other thing that's been in here for a number of weeks and maybe months at this point are certain really slow composting food items. And we're going to see them as we make our way down. You know, those items are stuff like pieces of corn cob. I had taken the corn cob and you know, chopped it into little discs. They're rings now because the middle of the disc has been eaten out in most cases. The worms really do seem to enjoy the inside of the corn cob more than anything else on the corn cob. These are coming along pretty nice too, I gotta say. These are mango seeds, but they don't look like mango seeds because a mango seed's a little bit bigger, and I had chopped these into bits to help with the breakdown process. You always help the breakdown process of a larger piece of food by maximizing its surface area. And even though, you know, a mango seed is a pretty tough food item, they'll break it down in time. Just have to be patient. And there are quite a number of them in here, as you can see. I'm kind of picking them out here one by one. And these 3 pieces don't necessarily make up the same mango seed, but those were sort of like the 3 different segments of this, you know, where there had been, maybe this one was really just cut in half. But in this case, this was the end of one. This was the middle of one. Here too, this might have just been one that had been cut in half. And I wonder what this is. One thing that I had been putting into these, and this might be it right here, this might be the avocado seed. Avocado seed is like, it's like a little marble. It's so hard when it starts out, but it does seem like the worms have actually been making their way through this thing quite nicely. Amazing. I mean, you would not be able to do this for sure on one that you just took out of the avocado. But it's pretty amazing to see that I can actually break it up in my hand at this point. Because typically an avocado pit is like a rock. I mean, it is rock hard. And that's the first time I've ever seen one get that far. So that's pretty cool to see. I'm pretty impressed. Not even sure what this is. It's just a bunch of compost stuck together. It's just interesting to see because I'm not seeing any signs of the previous feeding. No newspaper, none of the food that was added. This is another avocado seed. Amazing. I can't believe that. You don't know how long I've been waiting to see this happen. A buddy of mine handed me a number of these and he was just curious. He's like, hey, what would happen if we put these in the worm bins? And I told him, I said, don't hold your breath, man. Those things seem pretty hard. But there we go. They're finally getting broken down. And now that I've kind of fragmented them into little bits, they probably won't last very long either. Now this is a little bit different too. It's just another mango seed, but I had not cut it. I had simply cracked it open just to give the worms access to the inside. I think that's the key, is just to make sure they can get to the inside of it so that the shell can be consumed from all different angles. But yeah, I think this bin has definitely gone through the last feeding, and I don't see hardly any signs of anything. I thought I saw a piece of newspaper just now, but I didn't. It was something else. But nothing that I'm seeing appears to be the last feeding, unless by chance I just haven't gone down deep enough. Is that possible? Here we've got an actual entire corn cob. And these things take forever, and I mean forever. And that's the reason I had actually gone through the extra effort of hacking it into little discs to, you know, once again, like I mentioned earlier, increase the surface area to try to help with the breakdown process. And it certainly is helping, because the corn cobs that had been placed in here whole go back months and months and months. But those fragments that were cut up into little pieces go back maybe only about a month and a half, maybe 2 months tops. But are we finally getting to the last feeding? I believe we are. This is probably a piece of the paper that had been used to wrap up the food. So it does seem like we found a little tiny fragment of that last feeding from 12 days ago. Is that it? Is that the only piece? Here's another piece. Okay. But none of the food, just some of the paper, and not even a lot of it at all. A couple fragments. So that's pretty good to see. These night crawlers are doing a great job down here in this bin. I had started this population out, like I said, 69 weeks ago, 483 days. But at that time, they started out as just 500 cocoons. And a lot of people have asked me, what is the size of the population of the worms in here? And I could not tell you. I really have no clue. It would be very interesting, though, if I could at some point harvest this container in such a way that I could see every worm that's in it to try to get a sense of how many there are. But that would sort of defeat the purpose, because these flow-through systems, they have a hatch at the very bottom. And the whole idea is that you take out all this finished casting material by opening the hatch on the bottom and leaving all of this uncomposted stuff and the worms up top to continue. So these bins are not really, or these bags, they're not intended to be emptied entirely. They're just empty. They're just intended to be emptied periodically, ejecting only the finished castings at the bottom. So I think we've given ourselves a good landing pad down here to apply this feeding now. I always seem to take a lot more time than I originally think I will, because I get interested in seeing how the food they've gotten previously is coming along. I like just looking at the worms, how many there are, how the castings look. So I just can't seem to help myself. We're just going to take whatever was left here in this little container and drop it in. And that is a hearty feeding. Good, generous pile of food. I think just for good measure, I'm going to take a couple of my old coffee filters and throw them in here as bedding too. So it always does make good sense to complement the food that they're getting, which is pretty much a nitrogen food source with a carbon food source to balance things out. And in this case, the bedding is the carbon food source, and all the kitchen scraps are the nitrogen-rich food source, as is the coffee. High nitrogen content in that too. So with this much food, I bet we could definitely go another 12 days, no sweat, in this bin. Even though they do seem to do away with their food quite quickly, they've always got these slow composting items to turn to as well, if they eat up all the soft, easy to eat stuff that they've been given. So let's just take everything we picked out along the way and drop it back down into the feeding area. All of these scrap pieces of paper go back in as bedding. All of the slow composting food items we picked out along the way. Try to make sure that I submerge the food below the surface to try to minimize the onslaught of pests trying to come in here and get a free meal. My hope is that if I place the food that they're receiving deep enough, I'm not going to continue to see intruding insects. All right, very nice. Definitely like the way things are looking in this bin. But you could see I've got so much more room in this thing to go. I could just keep going and going in this thing. But at some point, maybe I'll just, you know, let it ride for a while, let them really break down everything in there, maybe even pick out some of the large things, so that at some point I can go through a harvest, but I don't know when I would want to do that. It does seem kind of fun just trying to push this to see how long it would take to really fill it up to the point where it would make sense to go through the harvest, because you're now out of space. But I'm thinking my reason for doing a harvest on this would be more out of curiosity, since I've never harvested a continuous flow-through system. I've had this system here for not the entire time that the European nightcrawlers have been in my possession. The bag came afterwards, but it's been over a year now, so at some point soon I'm gonna have to try harvesting this thing. All right, let's get things covered back up here, and then I got a little bit of cleaning up to do as well, but I'm not going to keep you around for that, because, you know, cleaning up and putting things away is boring. I'm not going to waste your time with that. So before I go and get to tidying up my workspace here, let me just say thank you. Thank you for watching. Please remember to give me a thumbs up if you enjoyed the video. I sure hope you did. And also consider subscribing to the channel as well. That's really appreciated. All right, everyone. Have a great day. Thanks for watching. Bye now.